Thank you so much for inviting me here tonight. It's really been fantastic. It's been an amazing day. I had a great morning this morning, morning tea with a lot of the elders here and was welcomed here. We had a fantastic smoking ceremony, so I want to thank you for that and thank you for that wonderful welcome as well, and to pay my respects to the traditional owners of this land and the land on whomever country that you come from as well. I was thinking about this, talking about racism today, and a quote came to mind. It was from the African-American writer James Baldwin. Some of you may have read some of James Baldwin's works. You certainly may have heard of James Baldwin. He's probably one of the most renowned black American writers. And he once said, "I have been to a place that white people say doesn't exist." I have been to a place that white people say doesn't exist. What he was talking about was our history. I have been to that place that they don't see. What he was talking about was race and racism. I've been to a place that they say doesn't exist. Because racism is one of those things that's so often in the eye of the beholder. Racism is like seeing ghosts. You tell people about it, and then people say, no, that can't be the case. You know, there's this sort of disbelief. And people don't want to believe that racism truly exists. And you'll often hear in Australia, but look at Australia. We're a multicultural country, we're a tolerant country, we're an inclusive country. And all of that's true. I look around the room here tonight and I do see not just our people, First Nations people, I see people from all different backgrounds. And that's one of the really remarkable things about Australia. And I've lived in parts of the world where we couldn't have this meeting. I've lived in parts of the world where free speech is banned, where difference and identity is violence. But because we have created a multicultural, tolerant society does not mean that we've eliminated racism. And particularly for First Nations people, the question of racism is built into the whole idea of Australia. How can it not be when the foundation of Australia is premised on the idea that planting a British flag in this soil was enough to extinguish the rights of people who have lived here for tens of thousands of years? That act in itself is a statement of racism and the power of racism. During that period, which is known as the Age of Discovery, it was widely accepted that countries not governed by a Christian monarch, a Christian king or queen, were free for the taking. Those ideas are founded in racism. At the birth of the modern world, as we know it, a European idea of what the modern world would be also came with the baggage of racism, the idea that there were peoples in the world who needed to be dragged into the future, dragged into progress, and that the ideas of the modern world were exported around the world at the point of a gun, that they were exported around the world in slave ships, and that we saw genocides of First Nations people all around the world. This is built into the fabric of our history. It is impossible to imagine the birth of the modern world without understanding the role of race. But where does that come from? Where does the idea of race and racism come from? Interestingly, when you go back to read the stories of ancient Rome or ancient Greece, these ideas that emerged out of those empires that created the modern world, you don't hear about race. There is no discussion of race. There were slaves, but slavery was not determined on the basis of race. It was determined on the basis of people who'd been conquered, and there could be white people who were slaves. There was no discussion of race itself. That race and racism is a modern invention. It is an invention. The idea of race is an invention. DNA studies that have decoded the genetic structure of human beings, shows that there is no racial difference in the world at all. There is none. Difference in skin colour, difference in appearance is entirely related to local conditions that people adapt to. It's a process of adaptation. In fact, a lot of studies have shown that there is more genetic variety within groups than between groups. That someone in Sweden may have a genetic structure almost identical to someone from Nigeria. There is no fundamental difference. Now, studies into DNA are often very surprising to people. You know, you hear these stories about people who go and trace their family tree or have their DNA done, and they suddenly find that they weren't who they thought they were. They suddenly find that there are Africans in their family. They chart their DNA and it lights up like a little map of the world, and you can see where you're from, and it shows that we are a human species. We share all of these things in common. So what is the idea of race? What comes first, race or racism? There's a fantastic book written by two sisters, Barbara and Karen Fields, African-American women. One is a sociologist and the other is an historian. And they called their book Racecraft. Racecraft. Why? Because they said it is like witchcraft. Race is like witchcraft. In the old times, when something went wrong, when the crops in the field died, when bad fortune came to communities, why would that happen? They blame it on some superstition. They blame it on something. Someone was a witch, and that's what caused this to happen. The power of witchcraft came from your power to believe in it. Witchcraft wasn't real until you believed in it. Then it became terrifyingly real. The same thing, they said, applies to race and racism. When we believe in it, it becomes real. Racism is the father of race, not the other way around. It's not that race comes first, it's that racism comes first. First, we decide that there is a hierarchy of race. Then we apply that hierarchy to ourselves, and we determine who sits on that hierarchy. And in the birth of the modern world, as the world developed in the age of discovery and people moving around the world and conquering lands and colonising lands and enslaving people, whiteness was built into the structure of that society. Just like witchcraft, racecraft came to take power on our belief in it. Didn't mean that it wasn't real. Because there is no scientific basis to race, it doesn't mean that it's not real. It is terrifyingly real when you're on the other end of it. When race can mean that you can be denied the right to vote, or that your children can be taken, or you can be told where you can live or who you can marry. Race becomes terribly real. Now, for me in my life, it's been absolutely shaped by ideas of race and racism. To be born into an Aboriginal family in the 1960s was to be born into a country that was not designed for you. That was the message that we got. I was born when we still had segregated, roped-off sections of the cinema, as people here would well remember. When we had to stand for God Save the Queen when you went to the cinema, or pledge allegiance to the flag and the Queen or God when you went to school, and we were not considered to be part of Australia. At that point, when I was born, we still weren't counted in the census. We were not counted in the population of Australia until after the 1967 referendum. But more than that, it was a lived experience of your history. I was born into a family that had been shaped by history. The invasion and colonisation of Australia meant that we were on the other side of history. To be Aboriginal meant that our family had experienced all the violence of the frontier wars, the massacres of people segregated, moved off their lands, put onto different missions, excluded, denied education, denied the opportunity to work, treated as second-class citizens, if they were citizens at all. In some cases, many cases, denied the right to vote. This was a hierarchy of race imposed in Australia, and that's what I was born into. It's what many people in this room have experienced, to carry the weight of history on our back, to be marked by someone's idea of what you were. It's been really interesting in my life as I've sort of grown up and moved around. When I was a kid, we moved around a lot. Dad was working on sawmills and Mum took work wherever we could get it. There was me and Mum and Dad and my grandfather and cousins and uncles and aunties and my brothers and my sister, all just moving around, constantly looking for work, moving from town to town. When I was a kid, undoubtedly, I was an Aboriginal person. That's what people saw. That was our family. We were the blacks. But it's been a really strange thing that as I've grown up, and I've been really lucky to have had opportunities in my life to get into a career in journalism, to travel the world, to experience different things, and to be in a situation where I have a really privileged life. And it's amazing how people see you differently then. Suddenly you become more like them. To the point that people will often say to me, "Oh, but you're different," or "You're not like the others." Who are the others? My sister? My brothers? My mum and dad? My cousins? Who are the others? Is there some sort of means test now where you get to a certain point of income or a certain point of success in your life and you're no longer black? But that's what racism is. It's illogical. It's not what's there, it's witchcraft. It is what people see. So when I was a kid, it was so easy to identify me as a black kid. Or my cousins were, mum and dad were, my friends were, we lived in the community. But now that I've travelled the world and I live in Sydney and I'm on television, it's like you're bleached. It's like suddenly you emerge as something else, something that other people can identify, can see. It's becoming visible to whiteness. It's becoming visible. And people feel more comfortable acknowledging who you are. And yes, they can acknowledge, oh yes, he's Aboriginal, but somehow you're different. Somehow you're not like the others. How different my life would have been if I hadn't been fortunate to find myself in a career that has given me so much. But one of the things that my career has given me has been the opportunity to travel the world. I've lived in 5, 6 different countries. I've reported from more than 80 countries. I lived outside of Australia for almost 20 years. Reported war and natural disaster, and I've seen the world up close. And everywhere I went, I still saw this question of race and colour and identity. It was once said that the colour line would be the great challenge of the 20th century. And that was true. All around the world. What was World War II fought over if not for some idea of a master race? The Nazis' idea of the master race and the genocide of Jewish people by the master race. The idea of racism has shaped the history of the 20th century. Stories that I reported asked me hard questions about my life, my country. Even when I was reporting Iraq or Afghanistan or Pakistan or North Korea or wherever I was, what did that tell me about my own country? What did that tell me about my place in the world? All the places that I reported from had experienced the same things. Upheaval, violence, conflict, invasion, generation after generation after generation. People who'd lost all certainty in the world, looking for a place to belong, looking for a way to explain who they were in the world. And I spoke to the kids at school today and I said the two things that most challenged me the two most dangerous ideas that I encountered in all my reporting around the world were history and identity. History and identity. History when it's denied, when it's silenced, when you don't get to be heard. Identity when it's denied, when it's silenced, when someone imposes an identity on you. But on the other side of that, when you have so much history that it can't see past your own hatred. When you have so much history that it poisons you against the world. When your identity is tied to history and that shapes everything about the world for you. There is no way out. Now I've seen this everywhere. History and identity. All the conflicts that I've reported, whether it be the conflicts of the Middle East, Shia versus Sunni Muslim, whether it be Rwanda, Hutu versus Tutsi, whether it be Catholic versus Protestant in Northern Ireland, whether it be North Korea versus South Korea, Hindu versus Muslim, Pakistan and India, all around the world. Who you are, who am I, what is my history, what have you done to me, what am I going to do to you? Vengeance, resentment, history, identity. They have been the things that sit at the heart of every single conflict in the world. Every single one that I've reported. Right now we're watching what's happening in Ukraine. Millions of people fleeing their homes. We don't know how many people are dead yet. We won't know how many until the guns fall silent, if ever. But we do know what it's about. Vladimir Putin has said absolutely what the war in Ukraine is about. It is about history and identity. What is it to be Russian? Who is Russian? What is it to be Ukrainian? I will decide what it is to be Ukrainian. I will roll my tanks into your country. I will kill your people because I will say what Ukraine is. History and identity. Now they may be both white people, but there is racism at the heart of that. In the same way that we saw racism at the heart of World War II or the wars of the Balkans, where you had Christian, Muslim, Serb, Croat, people fighting each other on the basis of history and the basis of identity. One of the real struggles in my life has been how to overcome those things. What do you do? How do you live in the world? And how do you build a world of peace and justice and reconciliation? Racism, like witchcraft, is going to be with us. It comes from ignorance, it comes from fear, it comes from suspicion, it comes from envy, and it reflects power. Where power exists, you see racism. Where people can impose power on you on the basis of race. But what do we do with it? What's our response to it? As someone who has lived our history and the brutal history of Australia, whose own family members have paid a price for this, and we all know as First Nations people in this room that we've got far too many of our people that we've buried far too young because of how hard it can be in Australia. What do we do with it? Is my history a burden? Is my history going to poison me against the world? The really hard question is, can you forgive and love even the person who has harmed you? That's a hard thing. Victoria is going to be going through, or is going through, a truth process right now. Truth is really important. But here's the more important thing. What are you going to do with truth? Vladimir Putin would say he's waging a war of truth. His truth of how the world should be. What do you do with truth? Does it set you free? Does it liberate you? Does it harden you? First, we have to tell the truth. First, we have to allow stories to be told. We have to allow people to speak the truth of what's happened to their families and allow that to free themselves from the burden of carrying stories that are not heard. But what are you going to do with it? I don't know. But I do know what happens when you can't unburden yourself from truth. How it poisons people and pits people against each other. That I do know, because I've stood in too many bombed out marketplaces where I've seen mothers picking up bits of burnt flesh and putting it into plastic bags because it's all they've got left to bury of their children. I've seen far too much of that to know what it is like to carry the burden of history and the hatred of history, how it pits us against each other. As I've gone on and reported these things and asked more questions about my own life, who have I turned to? Who are the people who've been the beacons of light for me? First of all, our own people, my elders, my parents, my grandparents, the struggle and the survival and the resilience of First Nations people to overcome in the face of such overwhelming odds to still be here today. That's the first inspiration. People like Nelson Mandela, after the end of apartheid in South Africa, when he could have set fire to the country, decided on a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Truth and reconciliation. To speak the truth, to set yourselves free, to reconcile the nation. It's a very hard thing to do. To have this idea of justice that comes from speaking the truth. Not justice that comes from a court, but justice that comes from the human spirit. An incredible thing that was. And I think of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who led a civil rights movement in the United States in the face of overwhelming oppression and violence and said, we won't respond violently to violence. And changed America, changed the laws of America. And yet still, America is a place that falls short, still fails, still wrestling with its questions of race, because it never ends. And in Australia, well, we haven't spoken the truth of our history. Not really. Well, we don't have treaties with First Nations people. We don't have recognition in our constitution of the place of First Nations people. That we're still on that journey. But even when we achieve those things, if we do, even if we have our truth commissions and we tell our truth, we're still going to be left with this question of how we live with all of that in the world. How do we live in peace with each other? That's the real challenge. Racism is going to be with us, and you heard before what racism looks like and what it feels like when someone gives you a bad look or there's a gesture or, you know, we know that. We know the racism of the schoolyard. We know the racist taunts that people can make. That's always going to be with us, but what do we do? That's what I hope we get tonight when we get to our panel discussion and we hear from people who've had a real lived experience of this, who are going to be open and honest and vulnerable enough to sit here and talk about those experiences. But what do we do? What is Australia? What does justice mean in Australia? What does truth mean in Australia? What does it mean to commit to living together? What does it mean to embrace difference but not exclusion? What does it mean to give up on the idea of racism that divides us into races? Racism divides us into races. Race doesn't exist, racism exists. We see this all around the world. It's in our history. It's carried on our backs. People live with the impact of it today. We know how choking it can be. But we also know that no matter where I've been in the world, that I've seen something more powerful than that. And that's the ability of people to endure, to find community, to find strength and resilience. That's why you're here tonight. That's why your voices are so important. That's why your stories are so important. Because what you bring and the truth you bring is the antidote to the witchcraft and the myth of racism that tries to divide us. Thank you so much. It's been really good to be here. I'm looking forward to our conversation. I think we're going to have a little break and have something to eat now, but we'll be back after that. We'll have our panellists here. You'll have a chance to put your questions and to discuss this question of what racism is, how it plays out in our lives, and what are we going to do about it. Thank you so much.